This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. The Structure of Story, a Storyworks Fiction Nuts and Bolts course is now open. You can find it at storyworksfiction.com. Welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Tonight, we are bouncing around a topic that I think we're going to have some fun sinking our teeth into here. The question is, how do you balance your character development and motivation and interactions in early drafts when your world building is critical to the story you're trying to tell? So it's kind of a problem of juggling two really major components of story here. Robert, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you kind of talk us into this topic.
Yeah, I'll give you a short version, I suppose. I get a bit worried that, especially with science fiction settings, that I'm get 50,000 words into my first draft and I'm at a key scene with a plot twist and everything's flying, and I suddenly realise there's a giant plot hole because of the way I set the science up, and I should have done more homework to start with. And that something's wrong in the world. I find it hampers me. I find that I probably don't free write as much in first draft because of that, and I tend to keep going back to the outline and go, oh no, that needs to be right. You know, it's frustrating. Balancing the two, because I know in the long run, most readers, let's say hard sci-fi accepted, most readers are going to forgive, or at least if you can suspend disbelief. If your character is powerful enough and the story is powerful enough, it will always trump, in my view anyway, the setting and the world building.
Right.
I do get caught up with, I'm writing a police procedural and they're doing an autopsy and I take them to the morgue and all of a sudden I've got people writing in saying, no, they don't do that in a morgue. What are you talking about? Oh no, but a key plot twist hung on the fact that it was in the morgue and the morgue was going to explode. So I don't know. Do you see my dilemma? It's
so
I let it hamper.
Yeah, so you get kind of knotted up in your early drafts because you have some anxiety around these key factors of the world or the plot that are hinged on factual things that readers could, hold against you, like errors of science.
Yes, and that's how I sort of projected into the future. I would never release something in that way because obviously there will be editors who pick it up. But in my first draft, I'm thinking, am I wasting my time because I'm going to get to a point where, I forgot. Yeah. I forgot that gravity doesn't work that way. Yeah. Oh, no.
Right.
So is it an unrealistic anxiety? Is it something? The silly thing is that it's never happened, So you kind of you get into a first draft and these things solve themselves, as you know, once you get the creative mind on it. But I do find that it's probably one of my facets of resistance.
So we're really talking about creative process here and how to push through that, or are we talking about craft and like?
Yeah, no. I think it's a bit of both. I think it is. How do you balance the factual with the getting the story down in the first draft and not worrying too much about that? What can you movie guys say? What can you fix in post without having to do a rewrite? And is there a value if you are really genuinely stuck on that and say getting together with another writer or a developmental editor or like yourself, Alida, and just borrowing a few points?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think there are a couple of approaches. One is to just write the first draft and get the story down, that character driven, generalized plot, and maybe have notes to yourself like learn this, find this out, research that. The other option is to take the painstaking approach and really stop the story every time you hit one of those walls and ask, what do I need to know here? What is the right setting or the right terminology or the right weapon or hyperdrive or whatever? Right. The thing is, but then storyboarding or outlining can be so helpful there because you get the markers, kind of the signposts along the way that you need to hit before you start drafting. So that might alleviate the anxiety because you know, like you could kind of put those benchmarks into the storyboard and then research before you draft. So you know you're going to have this key setting or you're going to have this key bit of science or this key bit of magic coming up in scene X. You know, so that might also help alleviate some of the first draft anxiety.
Yeah. I suppose maybe the question there is how key is this to what I imagine the story to be? Because most of these things can be written around as well. You know, they don't always have to be on the page. Because we're writing fiction, so we know it's not factual, it's not faction, it's fiction, and so as long as the reader can suspend enough disbelief, it could have happened. You know, the morgue scene may have been off page, and it's just something that we're hearing about, and so therefore, if you then discover when we're going through the editing and revising phase that it wouldn't have happened that way, it's easy to correct because it's only a couple of sentences as opposed to a full chapter, for example. Right. So I suppose, you know, into one's area of expertise and avoiding writing in an area where you just know you have no clue. If you're going to do that without any research, then that's obviously going to be a problem. And I'm not an intricate world, but I mean, you know, a few episodes ago we were talking to Micah about the lit RPG and the construction of the game world, and nothing would annoy me more than having to, before I wrote, to have to just come up with this entire. I might as well be a game designer then, you know, because writing's hard enough as it is without having to get all this stuff right.
No, I think that's where my balance is interesting too. Is like I write fantasy, but I am not a world builder. Like I love writing within intricate and fun worlds, but I tend to write those world building details in after I've drafted the story. I will not. I don't balance my pre and my post draft very well. I tend to do very minimal pre-writing and then find all my complications as I'm drafting and then have to go back and fix all the complications. But unless I'm really invested in the character, I don't care about the world at all. And so it's really interesting, you know, balance-wise for me, I'll write the story and the character and the plot, and then I'll have to go back through and say, okay, now I need to figure out how the religious system works in this world.
And how did the magic
get it
come
back
about
in
to do
through
this?
And, you know, and what are the rules for my magic system? Well, I did this and I did this and I did this, and this probably doesn't make sense anymore, so now I gotta balance it out afterwards. So it's interesting.
It's very heavy on the revision then, and a lot of sort of weaving back together.
Yeah, which is where I'm at right now, and it's really frustrating. But
note to listeners, really frustrating.
Really frustrating. But it's interesting because I don't know that I would have a story if I tried to do all of this beforehand.
So there's that process piece and knowing yourself and what you like to write. Yeah, and I just like to dive into a character's head and just start going, and then try and figure out more of the why and the depth and the how as I'm going, rather than trying to figure it all out beforehand. And
I'm with you. That's probably my process as well. Is you know, and I'm sure that for a lot of writers that's very similar, where you want to be in a character's head. That's why we read, you know. So maybe that's one of the reasons why we write as well, is because that's that vicarious life, and anything that slows you down in that, which is now I've got to figure out how a Boeing 747 lands. I'll just later. It's just going to hold the gun to the pilot's head.
Exactly.
Right. Well, and to go back to what Robert was saying about the plot hinging on these things, there are those elements that are so integral to the story you're trying to tell, where you do need to get it right, even if it's not something character related or not something you care about. So that's where the storyboarding process could come in very handy, you know, and even the stuff you don't really want to put on the page. I was just talking to someone last night who's reading Dark Corners in Skog, and I was saying, oh, there's this conference this year I might want to go to. It's all like police procedural and forensics and legal stuff. And you go and some of the stuff, they call it like hard hitters or something, where they have these heads. I just saw this on the website. They have heads and they're full of, liquid, and you hit them and then you can see the spatter pattern. And they tell you to get these spatter resistant aprons for this workshop. And my friend was like, ew. Why would you want to do that? He said, I don't like reading that kind of stuff. And I said, yeah. And I don't put that stuff on the page necessarily, but I know I need to know it because I know how much research I did for these mysteries, and how just to describe to the extent I want to for my audience, even a very limited description of something that could go gory, I still need to know, as the writer, where would the spatter go, for instance? So we do get like hung up on the technical details, even in the midst of very character-driven drafting.
Well, you need to know whether or not the character that did the beating on the head is going to have blood spatter on them when they walk out the door. That's what you need to know.
Yeah,
exactly. Because now I'm writing that character, and I've got to know how to describe, the after effects.
There was a really funny post in the Facebook group just the other day. It might have even been yesterday, and somebody had posted in there. So I found myself, typing into Google, but I thought I'd better ask here first because it's a bit more private. How would a wife accidentally kill her husband? And then she's edited it and later says, oops, I probably should have just told my husband I was posting this first before I asked. But you'd look at the Google search history of any writer and you think, oh, maybe I should have put hypothetically after that statement when I was saying, how do I blow up the local police station?
Right, I know.
So, Alida, how do you go with when you're doing historical fiction then? And also, it'd be interesting from an editor's point of view, what you do when you're editing someone's very sort of factually based historical or crime scene type fiction. What sort of things how do you go with your own writing first, I suppose?
Right. Well, I start with research, actually, because I have the story idea and the general shape of the story. So a storyboard, or at least, if not that much of the process done, my general plot points and my setting. I know where I'm going to be, when I'm going to be. I know that my characters have to wear clothing and eat food and travel. And, it's going to be France, so there will be old Roman roads they'll follow and rivers that will be trade routes. And, so I start with the research because my characters basically can't do anything in a vacuum.
Right. Yeah.
They could have dialogue, but that's about it. I need to know if they're burning wood or cow pies in their fireplace, and if they have a chimney or just a hole in the roof, or I can't even start to draft the story, the drama, if I can't see something of the world I'm putting them in.
That's right. Is that chase scene going to be on foot or on horse or in horse-drawn buggies or just newly invented motor vehicles? I can imagine.
I find it fascinating too because, okay, they didn't have elastic, they didn't have zippers, they didn't have... what do you do for holding your socks up, and how many layers of clothing do you wear? And, so it's pretty involved and time consuming, but I really enjoy it. It's a lot of reading and note taking. And then as I read something that interests me, that gives me an idea for a scene. So it feeds the story and the world building as I do the research. It's never an isolated process. Research and writing really go together, And as an editor, when I'm reading something, no matter the genre, I consider myself educated, informed, knowledgeable, but obviously not an expert in all the different areas my clients are writing in. So whenever something doesn't work for me, I let them know, because I'm raising a reader's objection. So either they've made an error, like a factual error, or an error of logic, or it's just my ignorance, but because of my ignorance on this point,
it seems incorrect to you.
It seems incorrect. So then it's on the writer to add a sentence or two in there to counter that reader's objection. So you can say, okay, a well-read, informed person, a general reader, is going to think this is wrong. So how do I write in,
Right. Mm-hmm. Which is why we have narrative exposition. And
right.
Purpose.
Exactly.
That's right.
For that and many other wonderful things.
Because Margaret, gravity doesn't work on small planets in the same way that it does on larger. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's what I do. All my dialogues like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So you two, we talked about historical, but fantasy and science fiction. How much research do you have to do, and is it part of your pre-writing, part of your revision? How do you kind of get past that hurdle of,
Mostly revision for me. There will be occasional, because I know that I can get a bit lost if I'm in that sort of the momentum of first draft. If I then have to think, oh, hang on a minute, what's Ganymede's gravity again? And then I've got to go, okay, is there another moon I can use that's close by because I want to have a strange food source? So it's a bit tough to. So usually what I'll do is I'll make notes in Scrivener. And then I will sometimes I'll label them as well as to fix or to research, because that kind of stuff is fairly easy to research and it probably isn't a plot point. But then I will go in first revision before it goes to any editor to write that out more, so that to me as a reader it seems to work and be more believable. And then my editor will come back and say, well, I didn't really get that. What did you mean by how the heat sources were formed? And I realise I've either written it too sparsely or too technically, or it just hasn't been woven into natural interchange between characters. I try not to, because of the reasons I said before. I try not to, because I find it a bit daunting, this whole idea of building my whole world or universe prior. I just have a very loose structure of what I think it is, and then I write to that. But as I say, occasionally that will hold me up, because I think, hang on a minute, I'm writing about this whole scene where they have a battle around a black hole, but I don't even know whether that would really happen. And that might stop me from doing something really creative, which is a shame.
Right, but you do want, on the one hand, you want the freeform creativity, but on the other hand, you want the mechanics of black holes to be at least plausible, right, in your world. So,
if it's key, if it's if it's a major turning point, then that's probably where I should stop and research it and maybe discuss it with somebody else. But being so internalized about the way that I tend to go about things, it will usually just stop me for a while. And then the usual thing, you're driving somewhere or you're having a shower or out for a walk, and you go, I know, I'll look this up. It's a shame because it slows the process down. And I'm sure I could probably do better if I just did what Kathryn did, which is, plow through the first draft and say, okay, well, I'll make it work one way or another. I'll make it work.
Yeah, I think my research is I just kind of don't do any research ahead of time. We'll say that. However, I love history. I love that whole thing. So I listen to a ton of history podcasts, and I'll read random history stuff for fun. So I'm kind of steeped in certain things already. And so I feel like instead of having to research a specific thing before I start writing, I usually sort of have a picture already. And then I'll go back after revision and say, oh, well, I really do need, 5 to 6 specific foods that they would eat in a region like this. Or I really do need to know, what kind of shoes they would wear. Or, something like that. And I maybe skimmed completely over that and just, wrote shoes. But know that, for color, for texture, for something fun, I'm going to go back and fill
you
that
can
in.
enrich it later, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. But the big things, I will stop if it's something that I just absolutely have to know. But there are very few of those, especially in fantasy worlds, that you can't just write around and then come back later. It would be very different if I was writing a more true to real life fiction. I think I'd be a lot more hardcore on my research because I'd want to have, more like almost like a map-like quality of, directions and knowing how far things are and, things like that. Whereas in a lot of times with my fantasy worlds, it's just kind of general ideas. And then I'll go back in and really tighten it down later.
Yes, I mean, I remember I stopped because I needed to know what the launch window was to get from the Earth to the Moon and where the typical launches are not to Earth to Moon, Earth to the ISS. And that was quite interesting research. Actually, it didn't even take very long. It was probably 20 minutes. Okay, I had enough of an answer that I could just keep going.
Yeah.
And I think you gave us a real clue there, Kathryn, about the sort of being steeped in. I was listening to a podcast recently with Joseph Knox, who has a book called Sirens, which I haven't read, but it sounds fascinating. And it's set in Manchester, where the author grew up and spent a lot of time in seedy bars. And that obviously gives the sense of realism that the interviewer was saying this is really great. But it's also, I think it's a crime, very detailed crime detective story. And the author was asked, how did you research all of that? And he said, well, to be honest, I'm a voracious reader in that genre. So you pick up on stuff that other authors have written, and you know it to be factual because it's verified everywhere. And then for the things you don't know, there are equally books of non-fiction out there that will give you the answer. There's the internet that will give the answer, and there are plenty of author groups that will give someone in there. If you need, I need a nurse who specialises in, children's health, for example. There's always going to be someone in an author group that can give you that. So I think my limitations I place on myself are really very false. It's just that I sort of think it feels like it's work.
Right.
But it really, I've probably read as much science fiction as I could possibly cram into my life. So it's not like I'm not cognizant of some of the issues. I'm not likely to write something completely stupid that sci-fi readers would question.
Yeah. Do you keep up on scientific and technological advances and things like that?
Yeah.
Like, do you read? Yeah. I mean, like, that's the thing. Like, a lot of science fiction authors I know, like, that's what fascinates them already, right?
Yeah.
So they're already in that, what's happening now and what's going on and what the futurists are thinking and, all this stuff. So you kind of have a trajectory already. And so you don't necessarily have to spend 8 months reading on because you've already been doing it for 8 months. You just have been doing it in the background and not maybe consciously. So you might have to say, oh, I remember 3 months ago I read that article on that thing and I need to go find it. But, getting yourself involved and finding those places where that information is, already, so that you have it, going on in your brain. One, helps a lot with creativity and inspiration because you can say, oh, that's awesome. I'm going to pull it. And two, means that when you sit down to write, you don't necessarily have to do quite as much research from the beginning. You'll probably just have to go back and fill in gaps.
Yeah, we're all looking forward to Alida's new series on splatter murders when she comes back to the conference.
Yeah. Well, I haven't signed up for it yet, but it's, I'm seriously considering it. I might need that.
You should. Even I might just need to report back on the podcast.
I know. All right, so listeners, if you want Alida to go and work on a spatter head, you can send your donations in.
So it sounds to me like really what I've expressed is an irrational fear that world building is somehow going to trip up my story, and as we talk through it, really, it's unlikely to.
Yeah.
Just simply because it maybe if I was writing completely out of genre, so let's say I chose to write a Tudor romance, I haven't the faintest clue
Yeah, just the idea is making us laugh.
People are going to read it and go, what are plasma daggers doing in Tudor romance? That's ridiculous.
Right.
They've never had those.
For that. I'd probably cross over.
Yeah, that's true.
Tudor sci-fi, it's a new category. I'm going to invent it.
Yeah, totally.
Well, actually, thinking about it, that's not so silly. Pierce Brown's Red Rising series, is really based on Roman and Greek society, and a marvelous job being done there, and integrated with sort of caste-based societies as well. So, yeah, plenty of people. What was I reading recently? Sarah J. Maas, A Court of Thorns and Roses. Have you read that, Kathryn?
Yeah.
That's retell of Beauty and the Beast, I think. So, yeah. There you go. There's
there
maybe
you
always
go.
a month. I'm going to get to my Tudor sci-fi romance now.
Right.
That's
The
right.
more things
Yes.
you can cross together, the more entertaining.
Yes, and this week on the round table, we had a little therapy session for Robert, and got him past his fear of intense world building, slowing down first drafts. So,
Exactly.
thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.